The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow upon the bustling streets of Chennai. Life here moved with an energy of its own, a vibrant symphony of honking horns, street vendors calling out their wares, and families weaving through crowds in the never-ending pursuit of dreams. Amid this tapestry of life, one man walked quietly down an unfamiliar lane, pausing every so often to admire the towering glass buildings that seemed to touch the clouds. His name was Sundar Pichai, father of Sundar Pichai, the globally respected CEO of Google and Alphabet. But Sundar was not dressed like a man whose son led one of the world's most influential technology companies. Clad in a simple white dhoti and a faded shirt, his sandals worn thin by years of faithful service, he cut the figure of a modest aging engineer. The lines on his face spoke of a lifetime of hard work and unspoken sacrifices, made not for fame or fortune, but so that his children could reach heights he had never dared to dream of. It had been many years since he had wandered the commercial heart of the city. The world had changed. Where once stood small sari shops and modest tea stalls now rose gleaming temples of consumerism, luxury boutiques flaunting names he had only seen in foreign magazines. His heart brimmed with curiosity, but also a quiet hesitation. Still, he had come here for a purpose. Earlier that morning, Sundar had called him from Mountain View, his voice gentle and full of love. "Appa," he had said, "it's been a long time since you treated yourself. There's a new store in Chennai, House of Elegance. I know you love fine leather. Please, just this once, buy yourself something nice. Consider it a gift from me." Sundar had laughed then, the deep, hearty laugh of a father who had always found joy in simplicity. But beneath that laughter was a tug, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, it was time to accept this small kindness from his son. And so here he was, standing before the grand entrance of the House of Elegance, its glass doors glistening under the afternoon sun. Inside, air conditioning whispered cool breezes over marbled floors. Crystal chandeliers hung like stars from the ceiling. The scent of rich leather and imported colognes filled the air. Well-heeled patrons wandered between racks of designer clothing and shelves of handcrafted accessories. With a tentative step, Sundar entered. Almost instantly, heads turned. Shoppers clad in crisp suits and designer saris glanced at him, their gazes flickering with curiosity and, in some cases, thinly veiled disdain. The contrast between the elderly man in humble attire and the glittering opulence of the store was stark. At the front counter, a young saleswoman named Priya caught sight of him. She was impeccably dressed, her hair sleekly tied, her smile carefully practiced. But as her eyes took in his worn sandals and simple clothing, that smile faded into a cold professional mask. "Good afternoon, sir," she greeted, her tone clipped. "May I help you?" Sundar, unaware of the undercurrents swirling around him, smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, my daughter. I am looking for a fine leather wallet. My son insisted I buy one from here." Priya's eyes narrowed slightly. She had seen this before. People who wandered in with no real intention to buy. Curious villagers dazzled by the lights of luxury. Time was valuable, and such patrons rarely made it worth her while. "Sir," she said, her voice cool, "our products are very expensive. Perhaps you might find something more suitable elsewhere." For a moment, her words hung in the air, sharp as glass. Around them, a few nearby customers looked on, some with mild amusement, others with indifference. Sundar blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "I see," he said softly. "But my son told me this store carries the best leather in Chennai. He wanted me to choose something good." Priya's patience thinned. "Sir, we cater to a very exclusive clientele. If you cannot afford our items, it would be best not to waste your time here." Her words were no longer subtle. They struck like a slap, carrying the unspoken judgment that he did not belong. A silence followed, a heavy, uncomfortable stillness. For the first time in many years, Sundar felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. But more than that, he felt an aching sadness. He had worked with dignity all his life. Now in this glittering cage of wealth, he was being reduced to appearances alone. Gathering what remained of his pride, He straightened his back. "Very well," he said quietly. "I will not trouble you further." Turning on his heel, he walked out into the blazing sun. The brightness outside blurred his vision, but not from the light alone. In that moment, he felt the sting of rejection, not because he had been denied a wallet, but because the worth of a man had been measured by the cut of his cloth. Back in his modest home, Raghunatha tried to brush off the encounter, but his wife Lakshmi noticed his subdued demeanor. Over evening tea, he finally relented and told her what had happened. Lakshmi's eyes flashed with anger. "How dare they speak to you like that? You should have told them who your son is." But Raghunatha shook his head, his voice calm. "What would that prove? If a man must declare his connections to be treated with respect, then something is wrong with the world." Later that night, Sundar called again. This time, Raghunatha hesitated before answering. But as soon as his son's warm voice filled the line, the dam broke. Quietly, he told Sundar everything. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Sundar spoke, his voice low but steady. "Appa, you should not have been treated that way. No one deserves to be judged by their clothes or appearance." He paused, his words laced with resolve. "Leave it to me. I'll be in Chennai next week. We'll visit that store together." But in the days that followed, the story took on a life of its own. Priya, in her youthful arrogance, had shared a boastful account of the incident on her private social media. "You won't believe the old man who walked in today thinking he could buy something from us," she had written. The post spread like wildfire, reaching the feeds of countless employees across Google India, and eventually landing on the desk of Sundar's closest aide. By the time Sundar arrived in Chennai, the entire city was abuzz with whispers of what had transpired, and that was only the beginning. The week that followed the painful incident at the House of Elegance unfolded in ways no one could have foreseen. What had begun as a careless moment of arrogance by a single store clerk now rippled outward like waves disturbed by a single stone. In the age of social media, stories traveled faster than the wind, and so it was with this one. Priya's thoughtless post, laced with smugness and condescension, was screen captured and shared far beyond her circle of friends. Within 2 days, it had reached the inboxes of journalists, business bloggers, and even members of Chennai's close-knit entrepreneurial community. The irony of it all, that the man she had dismissed as unworthy was the father of none other than Sundar Pichai, stoked public outrage and deep reflection. Meanwhile, in Mountain View, Sundar sat in his glass-walled office, gazing at the gentle curve of the California hills beyond. Yet his mind was not in Silicon Valley. It was in Chennai, in the quiet dignity of his father, in the injustice that had wounded not just the elder Pichai's pride, but something deeper, his lifelong belief that respect should never be bound to wealth or status. The knowledge burned within Sundar. All his life his father had taught him humility and grace. It was from him that Sundar had learned the value of hard work, the quiet strength of integrity, and the importance of seeing the humanity in every soul, regardless of outward appearances. Now the world had offered a cruel lesson in the very opposite. After reading the viral post, Sundar's team had forwarded him screenshots and a full report. His father had not told him about the social media angle, perhaps out of humility or a desire not to trouble him, but the truth was now out in the open. Sundar knew there would be temptations to respond with public condemnation or corporate pressure. Yet such measures would only escalate the situation and shift the focus away from what truly mattered. Instead, Sundar began planning a different kind of response, one that would uphold the values his father had lived by all his life. A few days later, he boarded a flight to Chennai. It had been months since he had been back, and as the plane touched down, a rush of childhood memories flooded him. The humid air, the vibrant colors, the sounds of street vendors, the scent of jasmine, all of it welcomed him home. At the family house, Lakshmi greeted him with a warm embrace. His father, ever reserved, smiled quietly. but the glint of love in his eyes spoke volumes. Over dinner, Sundar listened again to the story of that day, this time from both his parents. His father recounted the encounter without bitterness, only a touch of sadness. "I wasn't angry, Sundar," Raghunatha said softly, "just disappointed that the world still judges a man so easily." Sundar reached across the table and clasped his father's hand. "Appa, I will not let this go unanswered. Not with anger, but with the message you've always taught me, that every person deserves dignity." The next morning, as news of Sundar's arrival in Chennai began circulating, reporters staked out the House of Elegance, sensing an impending confrontation. But Sundar had no interest in theatrics. Instead, he arranged a quiet meeting with the store's owner, Mr. Ramesh Iyer, a prominent businessman known for both his success and his occasional vanity. The meeting took place in a discreet conference room above the store. Ramesh, visibly nervous, greeted Sundar with elaborate apologies. "Mr. Pichai, please believe me, I had no knowledge of this. The clerk acted entirely on her own. I assure you we will terminate her employment at once." But Sundar raised a hand. "Mr. Iyer, this is not about one person. It's about the culture we create. Firing someone may appease public outrage, but it won't change attitudes." He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Instead of punishment, I would suggest education. Let this be an opportunity to teach your entire staff about dignity, respect, and humility. Every customer who walks through your door deserves to be seen for who they are, not what they wear." Mr. Iyer was taken aback. He had expected anger, perhaps even legal threats. Instead, here was a call to conscience. After a long pause, he nodded. "You are right, Mr. Pichai. We will implement a new training program immediately. And please, allow me to apologize in person to your father." Sundar agreed, but made it clear. No grand public gesture, no media spectacle. "My father values sincerity above showmanship. If you truly mean it, do it quietly." Meanwhile, across Chennai, the story continued to evolve. On social media, thousands of ordinary citizens shared their own experiences of being judged by appearance. Stories from shop floors, banks, offices, and even hospitals. A wave of collective reflection swept through the city. Hashtags like "respect without judgment" and "every person matters" began trending, sparked by a simple story that had touched a universal nerve. The next afternoon, Sundar and his father returned to the House of Elegance, not through a back door but through the main entrance, heads held high. The store was quiet, its usual hum subdued. Mr. Iyer met them personally, accompanied by a humbled Priya, her face pale and her voice trembling. "Mr. Pichai, sir, I am so deeply sorry," she began, her words genuine now, stripped of the arrogance that had once colored them. Raghunatha looked at her kindly. "Child, it is easy to judge a man by his clothes. Harder, but better, to see the heart within. I hope you will remember that." Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded earnestly. Mr. Iyer presented a handcrafted leather wallet as a gift of apology, but Raghunatha gently declined. "Thank you, but I do not need gifts, only a change of heart." Sundar smiled softly. His father, even in this moment, had remained true to his values. Yet the story did not end there. In the days that followed, Sundar took the opportunity to speak at a local university event about leadership and ethics. There, before an audience of young minds, he recounted the incident, not to shame the store, but to teach a lesson. "We live in an age of great progress," he said. "But progress means nothing if we forget the simple truth. Every human being deserves respect, not because of their wealth or position or clothing, but because they are human." The speech resonated deeply. Clips of it spread online, drawing praise from across India and beyond. Many called it a masterclass in graceful leadership. But for Sundar, the real victory lay in the quiet transformation sparked in hearts across Chennai. Conversations about empathy and dignity were taking root, in boardrooms, classrooms, and homes. At home, Raghunatha and Lakshmi watched the growing impact with quiet pride. One evening, as the family gathered for a simple meal, Raghunatha looked at his son with a gentle smile. "You have done well, my boy. Not for me, but for many who will never be judged so quickly again." Sundar shook his head humbly. "I only followed your example, Appa. You taught me what matters." Outside, the city lights flickered under a velvet sky. The House of Elegance had begun its cultural transformation, and across Chennai countless people walked a little taller, their hearts emboldened by a simple but profound truth: every person matters. But little did Sundar know, the ripple effects of this small act were about to cross oceans. For in Silicon Valley, global leaders and corporations were taking notice. Soon, Sundar would face an even larger platform where this message of dignity would be tested on a world stage. The air in Chennai had shifted. What had begun as a private insult was now a citywide conversation about human dignity, one that was rapidly gaining momentum far beyond its humble origins. The newspapers and digital outlets had, without sensationalism but with sincerity, chronicled the story of Sundar Pichai's father being dismissed in a luxury store. Yet the narrative had evolved from one of personal slight to a wider call for social reflection. Thought leaders and influencers were now engaging openly in debates about status, perception, and respect. From tea stalls in bustling street corners to panel discussions on television, everyone had something to say. Yet amid this whirlwind of public attention, Sundar remained grounded. He had returned to Mountain View, but part of his heart remained in Chennai. At the Google campus, his days resumed with their usual intensity: product strategy meetings, engineering reviews, and high-level discussions about AI ethics. Yet, in quieter moments, he reflected on what had transpired back home. One particular evening, as he walked alone through the tranquil paths surrounding the Googleplex, he received a call that would set a new chapter in motion. It was from Ms. Deepa Rao, an influential journalist and the moderator of an upcoming Global Tech and Ethics Summit to be held in New York. Deepa, with her signature blend of sharp intellect and deep humanity, had followed the story closely. "Sundar," she began, her voice warm yet purposeful, "the world has been watching your response in Chennai. It's rare for a leader of your stature to handle such a personal situation with such grace and moral clarity. I would like to invite you to deliver the keynote at the summit, not about technology, but about human values in the age of technology." For a moment, Sundar hesitated. His career had been built on technical brilliance, innovation, and global leadership. Yet he knew that the heart of leadership was not just about products and profits. It was about purpose. After a thoughtful pause, he replied, "Thank you, Deepa, I will do it. Not for me, but for the millions who deserve to be seen for who they are." Preparations for the summit began immediately. The event would draw CEOs, policymakers, educators, and thought leaders from across the world. But Sundar's mind was not on crafting a corporate message. Instead, he poured his heart into writing a speech that honored his father's values and addressed a universal truth. He spent nights reflecting on stories from his own life, moments where dignity or its absence had shaped him. Memories of his father rising at dawn to work tirelessly at the British conglomerate GEC, despite limited means, fueled his words. He recalled times in his own early career when he, too, had been underestimated, before the world came to know the name Sundar Pichai. Meanwhile, the story's ripple effects continued to spread. Inspired by Sundar's response, several luxury brands in India announced new training initiatives for their staff, focusing on empathy and customer dignity. Universities incorporated the story into ethics courses, using it as a modern parable on values in an unequal world. Even in Chennai, where class lines were often deeply ingrained, the conversation around how we judge worth was now being held openly, in homes, classrooms, and boardrooms alike. Sundar's father, ever humble, watched these developments with mixed emotions. One afternoon, speaking to Lakshmi as they sipped tea on their modest balcony, he said quietly, "I never imagined my small humiliation would lead to something so large." Lakshmi, her eyes shining with pride, replied, "You always said that values matter more than status." Now the world is learning that too. The day of the summit arrived. The grand auditorium in New York was filled with the brightest minds of the tech world, its stage adorned with minimalist elegance. As Sundar was introduced, the room fell into an attentive hush. The speaker who had revolutionized mobile computing and cloud technology now stood before them, not as a technocrat, but as a son, a human being, and an advocate for universal dignity. Sundar began simply. A few weeks ago, in my hometown of Chennai, my father was turned away from a luxury store because of how he looked. The clerk did not see a kind, accomplished engineer or a loving father. She saw an old man in simple clothes. In that moment, she reminded us of a truth we often ignore. In the rush of modern life, we forget to see the person behind the appearance. The hall was silent, every ear strained to catch his words, for they resonated far beyond commerce and code. Sundar continued, weaving in lessons from his father's life. He spoke of the sacrifices that built the bridge to his own success, of the dignity inherent in every act of labor, of the unseen worth that lies beyond titles and brands. As technologists, he said, we build tools that connect billions. Yet if these tools do not also carry forward the values of empathy and respect, then we are building an empty future. The audience erupted in applause, not perfunctory but heartfelt. Sundar's message had transcended the usual rhetoric of innovation. It had touched something deeper. The speech quickly became the most shared moment of the summit. Clips of it were viewed by millions online, accompanied by thoughtful commentary. In the days that followed, major media outlets praised Sundar's rare blend of humility and moral leadership. Tech publications hailed it as a call for a new kind of leadership in Silicon Valley, one grounded not just in intelligence but in integrity. Back in Chennai, the response was even more profound. Young professionals, inspired by Sundar's words, began organizing workshops on empathy and customer service industries. Corporate leaders adopted new guidelines to foster more inclusive environments. Even educational institutions began emphasizing values education alongside technical training. Yet through it all, Sundar remained focused on the personal heart of the story. During a quiet moment back home, speaking again with his father, he said softly, "Appa, the world may remember the speech, but for me, the real lesson came from you. You faced humiliation with grace, not anger. That taught me more than any victory in business ever could." Raghunatha, his voice gentle, replied, "Remember this always, my son. Greatness lies not in how high you rise, but in how you treat those around you, especially when no one is watching." As father and son sat together in the warm twilight, the city of Chennai pulsed with renewed hope. Across India and the world, a simple story had become a beacon, reminding all who heard it that dignity, above all else, is a right, not a privilege. Yet the journey was far from over. For even as Sundar's message spread globally, new challenges awaited, ones that would test whether this new commitment to dignity would endure beyond the headlines. And in the quiet resolve of Sundar Pichai, one thing was certain. The story would continue, not in words alone, but in actions. The glow of Sundar Pichai's words at the Global Tech and Ethics Summit lingered far beyond the walls of that grand New York auditorium. Across continents, in the corporate boardrooms of London, the coffee houses of Bengaluru, the classrooms of Johannesburg, and the bustling startup hubs of Tokyo, discussions unfolded, not about artificial intelligence or quantum computing, but about the simple, timeless truth he had shared, that human dignity must be at the heart of progress. Yet as the applause faded and the viral clips of his speech circled the internet, Sundar remained acutely aware that true change was not measured by views or headlines, but by the transformations that unfolded quietly, over time, in hearts and actions. Returning to Mountain View, Sundar resumed his work with a renewed sense of purpose. He called for a series of internal reflections within Google itself, discussions about how employees interacted with users, clients, and even each other. If we ask the world to embrace empathy and respect, he told his leadership team, we must model it ourselves in every email we write, in every product we launch. Initiatives were soon underway to incorporate deeper training on unconscious bias, inclusive leadership, and customer empathy across the organization. But while his work in Silicon Valley carried forward, the story continued to evolve back in India. In Chennai, the House of Elegance underwent a quiet transformation. True to their promise, the store's leadership brought in experts to conduct empathy and dignity training for the entire staff. Priya, the young saleswoman whose careless dismissal of Sundar's father had triggered this cascade of events, embraced the opportunity to learn. She volunteered to assist with the training sessions, speaking openly about her own blind spots and growth. Her vulnerability resonated with her colleagues, and soon turned her into an unlikely advocate for change. "We must remember," she shared during one session, "that behind every customer is a story we cannot see. It is our duty to approach each person with humility and respect." The story rippled outward still. A coalition of Chennai's leading retailers and hospitality businesses came together to launch a broader initiative called Respect First, aimed at transforming customer experience across the city. The initiative garnered support from civic leaders, educational institutions, and citizen groups, all united by the belief that dignity must not be conditional. Sundar's father, Raghunatha, watched these developments with quiet amazement. He had returned to his daily routines, morning walks through the neighborhood park, afternoon tea with Lakshmi, occasional visits to his local library, yet life now felt different. Strangers occasionally stopped him on the street to offer words of support or gratitude. Some even called him the man who reminded us all to be human. Yet fame had never been his desire. Over a simple dinner one evening, he confided to Lakshmi, "I only wish that people will remember the message, not the messenger." Lakshmi, ever wise, replied, "That is why your message carries such power. You asked for nothing but change." Back in Mountain View, Sundar prepared for his next challenge. He had been invited to address a global gathering of top Fortune 500 CEOs at the World Business Leaders Forum in Geneva. The theme of the forum that year, Leadership for a Humane Future, aligned perfectly with the conversation he had sparked. Yet Sundar approached the opportunity with careful thought. He knew that the corporate world often spoke in the language of profits, market share, and innovation pipelines. Convincing such an audience to embrace empathy and dignity as core leadership principles would require more than inspirational words. It would demand a practical, actionable vision. In the weeks leading up to the forum, Sundar worked closely with a small team of trusted advisors. Together, they crafted a blueprint called Human-Centered Leadership, a framework that positioned respect, inclusion, and dignity not as soft ideals, but as critical drivers of organizational resilience and innovation. The core argument was simple yet profound. Companies that foster respect outperform those that tolerate disrespect. Teams built on dignity collaborate more deeply, innovate more freely, and serve customers with genuine care. Sundar grounded the blueprint in both research and stories, including at its heart the story of his father's experience in Chennai. The Geneva Forum unfolded in a grand hall beneath soaring chandeliers and intricate tapestries. The audience was formidable: CEOs of global banks, leaders of top technology firms, heads of consumer giants. Sundar took the stage with calm resolve. He began by sharing the story of Chennai, not as a tale of outrage, but as a universal parable about leadership and culture. The way we treat one person in a store reflects the culture of our organizations and ultimately our societies, he said. If we allow status and appearance to dictate respect, we undermine the very fabric of trust that sustains our businesses and communities. He then presented the human-centered leadership blueprint, urging companies to embrace empathy, not as an afterthought but as a strategic priority. His address was met with rapt attention. Many in the audience had grown weary of leadership narratives focused solely on disruption and dominance. Here was a vision that spoke to the deeper purpose of leadership. As Sundar concluded, he said, "Technology may change the tools of our world, but the heart of progress will always be human. The forum buzzed with conversation long after he left the stage. Several CEOs approached him privately, expressing both gratitude and intent to implement aspects of the blueprint within their organizations. One particularly heartfelt moment came when an elderly European industrialist, known for his gruff demeanor, clasped Sundar's hand and said, "You reminded me why I started this company decades ago, not to build machines but to serve people." Back in Chennai, news of Sundar's Geneva speech reached local media. Editorials praised his unwavering commitment to dignity and human values. Schools began incorporating discussions on empathy and leadership into their curricula. At the House of Elegance, Priya and her colleagues organized an open house event titled Lessons in Respect, inviting customers to engage in dialogue about service and humanity. The event drew a diverse crowd and sparked meaningful conversations between staff and patrons. One elderly gentleman stood up during the discussion and said, "For many of us, shopping in such stores has always felt intimidating. But today I feel seen, not for what I wear, but for who I am. That is the real luxury." Sundar's parents watched these developments with a mix of pride and humility. One evening, as Sundar called home, his father said, "You have turned a small wound into a great healing. That is the mark of true leadership." Sundar replied softly, "Appa, I only followed the path you showed me." Yet even as this chapter of the story reached new heights, deeper questions emerged. Could this movement for dignity extend beyond the walls of corporate stores and conferences? Could it reshape education, public services, even politics? Sundar sensed that the journey was far from over. The spark had been lit, but it was now time to turn that spark into a lasting flame. And in the quiet conviction of one humble family in Chennai and their son who had risen to global leadership, the next chapter was already beginning. The movement, that had begun from a single incident in a Chennai boutique, now rippled across continents in ways even Sundar Pichai had not foreseen. What touched hearts the most was not merely the incident itself, but the extraordinary humility with which Sundar and his father had handled it. In a world often hungry for outrage, here was a story of quiet strength, forgiveness, and a refusal to retaliate. It was this moral clarity that resonated so deeply. But as the headlines moved on and the news cycle began its restless churn, Sundar remained determined that the message would not fade into the background noise of the digital age. Real change required sustained effort, not fleeting applause. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Following his speech in Geneva, Sundar was invited by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, to contribute to their global initiative on human dignity in education and innovation. It was an ambitious project aimed at embedding values of empathy, respect, and dignity into the educational systems of participating nations. For Sundar, this invitation struck a profound chord. His own life had been shaped by the values taught at home and reinforced through education. Now he had a chance to help ensure that future generations would grow up in cultures where respect was a default, not a privilege earned through status or wealth. He agreed without hesitation. In preparation for UNESCO's Global Values in Education conference in Paris, Sundar and a diverse team of educators, sociologists, and policy experts began crafting a framework that could be adopted across cultures. The core principle was universal. Teach children from the earliest stages of life that dignity is non-negotiable. But the approach needed to be practical, adaptable to different educational systems, and sensitive to cultural nuances. Over long nights in quiet conference rooms and spirited virtual discussions with global educators, Sundar's team shaped the framework. They included modules on emotional intelligence, historical reflections on discrimination and inclusion, role-playing, exercises to foster empathy, and digital literacy components to counter the rising tide of online disrespect. Throughout this process, Sundar drew deeply from personal memory. He recalled his school years in Chennai, the humility of his teachers, the dignity with which they treated even the poorest students. He remembered his father's words about valuing effort over appearance and the countless small acts of respect that had shaped his own worldview. These reflections found their way into the framework's guiding philosophy, that dignity must be lived, not merely taught. The Paris conference arrived, gathering education ministers, NGO leaders, and thinkers from around the world. As Sundar took the stage, he sensed the weight of the moment. He began by recounting once more the story of his father's rejection in Chennai, not to shame or indict, but to illuminate how subtle acts of disrespect can wound, and how acts of courage and grace can heal. Education, he told the gathering, is where we plant the seeds of the future. If we want a world where technology serves humanity rather than divides it, where innovation lifts us all rather than a few, then we must teach every child the foundational truth. Every human being deserves dignity. He unveiled the framework, urging nations to adopt it not as a mandate, but as an invitation to reimagine education's moral purpose. The reception was overwhelming. Delegates from over 30 countries pledged to pilot the dignity modules in their school systems. UNESCO itself committed to creating a global coalition to support and expand the initiative. As the conference concluded, Sundar was approached by a soft-spoken Kenyan educator named Miriam Odidi. With tears in her eyes, she said, "In my village, school, children walk for miles barefoot. They come from homes without electricity or running water. Yet they carry dignity in their hearts. Thank you for reminding the world that this dignity must be honored and protected." Her words touched Sundar deeply. They affirmed what his father had always believed, that true worth lies not in possessions but in the spirit within. Meanwhile, in Chennai, the story continued to inspire. The Respect First initiative had grown into a citywide movement, with posters in shops and buses reminding citizens, every person matters. Public service offices began adopting new training programs inspired by the framework Sundar had shared in Paris. The House of Elegance, once the unlikely catalyst of this transformation, had become a symbol of it. Its leadership, led by Mr. Iyer and Priya, now collaborated with NGOs to provide dignity and service training across Chennai's retail sector. Priya, once the clerk whose misjudgment had sparked the original incident, had become a quiet advocate for change. At one training session, she told new recruits, "I learned this lesson the hard way, but I am grateful. It taught me to see the person before the clothes, the story before the surface." In the Pichai household, life remained modest. Raghunatha continued his morning walks and afternoon chess games with old friends. He resisted all suggestions of public recognition, saying, "I am just a father who taught his son a few simple values. That is enough." But one evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Sundar shared news that touched his father's heart. "Appa," he said softly, "UNESCO wants to name the Dignity Education Initiative in your honor. They asked if we could call it the Pichai Principles, so that generations of children will know where these values came from." For a long moment his father said nothing. Then, voice thick with emotion, he replied, "Only if you promise me one thing. Do not let it become about a name or a brand. Let it always be about the values." Sundar clasped his father's hand. "I promise." The months that followed saw the Pichai principles adopted in pilot programs across schools in India, Kenya, Sweden, and Brazil. Educators reported powerful early results, children showing greater empathy, classmates standing up for one another, young voices challenging disrespect when they saw it. The impact was not limited to classrooms. Parents shared stories of children, reminding them at home to treat everyone with kindness. In markets and offices, ordinary people cited the movement when choosing to act with respect in difficult situations. Back in Mountain View, Sundar reflected on this unfolding legacy. His career had been filled with technical achievements, but none had felt as deeply meaningful as this simple human endeavor. In a letter to Google employees, he wrote, "Let us remember, the greatest innovation is a world where every person is valued." Yet even as the movement gained global traction, new challenges loomed. Would the message endure as the initial attention faded? Could it withstand the forces of cynicism, inequality, and indifference that so often creep back in? Sundar knew. The answer lay not in grand speeches but in daily choices, in how leaders led, teachers taught, and ordinary people treated one another. And so, as the next chapter beckoned, Sundar prepared for the most important part of the journey. Turning a story into a sustained global culture. One evening, speaking again with his father, he said, "Appa, we've started something beautiful. Now we must protect it, nurture it, and help it grow." His father smiled gently. "Like all good things, my son, it will take patience, humility, and heart. But I have faith in you." And beneath the quiet stars of Chennai and the bright lights of Silicon Valley, a simple truth continued to shine. Dignity is the foundation upon which all true progress must stand. Months had passed since the spark of change had been lit in that quiet luxury store in Chennai, and the winds of transformation continued to sweep across cities, classrooms, and companies alike. What had begun as a moment of humiliation for one dignified man in simple clothes had grown into a global conversation on the value of human dignity, a movement that transcended language, borders, and status. Sundar Pichai, though gratified by the ripples of positive change, remained ever mindful of the responsibility that came with it. He understood well that movements built on moments of passion required sustained nurturing if they were to mature into lasting cultural shifts, and yet, as the months rolled forward, challenges began to arise, as they always do when deep societal change is attempted. Skeptics emerged in boardrooms and public forums. Some questioned whether an initiative rooted in empathy and dignity could truly coexist with the relentless pressures of capitalism and competition. Others dismissed it as an idealistic flourish that would fade once the headlines dimmed. But Sundar had anticipated this resistance. It only strengthened his resolve. He knew that if the principles his father had lived by were to endure on a global stage, they needed to be woven into the very structures of leadership, policy, and education, not treated as a transient campaign. With this in mind, Sundar convened a private summit in Mountain View, inviting a select group of trusted global leaders from business, education, government, and civil society. They gathered not under banners of brands or organizations, but as human beings committed to a shared purpose. The summit, held in a sunlit retreat on the outskirts of Silicon Valley, began with a simple exercise. Sundar asked each participant to share a personal story, a moment in their lives when they had been either denied or granted dignity. The room, filled with people accustomed to polished presentations and guarded public personas, became a space of raw humanity. Stories flowed of childhood poverty, racial discrimination, exclusion, and moments of unexpected kindness that had restored faith. By the end of the day, the group was bonded not by titles, but by a collective understanding. Dignity was not a luxury or a marketing strategy. It was the beating heart of human connection. From this gathering emerged a bold new vision, the Global Dignity Accord, a voluntary framework through which companies, educational institutions, and even municipalities could publicly commit to fostering cultures of respect and empathy. The accord was practical, not performative. It provided clear guidelines on leadership behaviors, employee training, customer experience, and community engagement. More importantly, it included transparent accountability mechanisms, because values, as Sundar often said, must live in deeds, not words. The launch of the Global Dignity Accord was timed to coincide with the anniversary of Sundar's Geneva speech, a symbolic reminder of the movement's origins. The response was extraordinary. Within weeks, hundreds of organizations across sectors and continents signed on. Tech giants, retail chains, universities, hospitals, and even local governments embraced the Accord's principles. Media coverage was overwhelmingly positive, but Sundar remained focused not on the headlines but on the grassroots impact. In Chennai, the Respect First initiative expanded into a citywide coalition involving schools, shops, government offices, and public transport systems. Citizens began to notice subtle but powerful shifts. Clerks greeting customers with warmth regardless of attire, officials treating every applicant with patience, children practicing empathy in schoolyards. The House of Elegance, now transformed, From a cautionary tale into a beacon of change, became a hub for ongoing dignity workshops. Priya, whose personal growth had become an inspiration, was invited to speak at conferences and leadership forums. Her story, once marred by a moment of misjudgment, now embodied the movement's core message. That change is always possible when met with humility and courage. Meanwhile, the Pichai principles in education gained global traction. UNESCO formally adopted them as a core component of its values in education agenda. Pilot programs in India, Kenya, Sweden, and Brazil reported remarkable outcomes: increased student empathy, reduced bullying, and a stronger sense of community in classrooms. Parents wrote letters of gratitude, sharing how the lessons their children brought home were transforming entire families. At Google, Sundar ensured that the movement remained deeply embedded in corporate culture. Dignity and empathy were now woven into leadership evaluations, product design discussions, and hiring practices. The shift was subtle but profound. Teams reported higher trust, greater psychological safety, and a renewed sense of purpose. Yet amid this global progress, Sundar remained grounded. For him, the true heart of the movement remained personal. One bright morning, he returned to Chennai to visit his parents. They greeted him with the same warmth as always, their modest home untouched by the fame their family name now carried. Over tea on the balcony, Sundar shared stories of the movement's latest milestones. His father listened quietly, a gentle smile on his face. Then, after a pause, he said, "You have done well, my son. But remember, movements may begin with leaders, but they live through ordinary people. Never let it become a show of the elite. Keep it close to the hearts of those who walk this earth in humble shoes." Sundar nodded, his father's words etching themselves into his heart. That afternoon, they visited the House of Elegance together, not for ceremony but to witness the quiet transformation. Staff greeted them with genuine warmth, customers browsed freely, and a poster near the entrance read, "Every person matters. Every story matters." Seeing this, Raghunatha turned to Sundar and said, "This is all I ever wanted, that people be seen for who they are." As the sun set over Chennai, casting a golden glow across the city's bustling streets, Sundar reflected on the journey. What had begun as a moment of pain for his father had blossomed into a global call to conscience, and yet the journey was far from complete. For the true test of the movement would not be its reach, but its endurance, whether it would inspire daily choices in quiet corners of the world where cameras never reached. In the years that followed, Sundar remained a steadfast steward of the cause. He spoke of dignity in boardrooms and classrooms, in public speeches and private conversations. He reminded leaders that true greatness lay not in towering buildings or soaring profits, but in the simple everyday act of honoring the humanity of those around us. And through it all, he drew strength from the example of his father, a man who had faced rejection with grace and had, through quiet integrity, changed the world in ways neither had imagined. One crisp evening, years later, as Sundar walked through Google's campus beneath a canopy of stars, a young engineer approached him hesitantly. "Sir," she said, "I joined this company because of your story about dignity. It changed how I see people. It changed how I want to lead." Sundar smiled softly. The movement lived on, not in grand declarations, but in the hearts of those who carried it forward. And somewhere, in a small home in Chennai, an elderly man sipped his tea and smiled, knowing that the values he had taught his son had found their way into the world, not as fleeting echoes, but as a lasting truth. For in the end, the message was simple yet eternal. Every person matters. Every story matters. And dignity, once given, can light the world. Time, as it inevitably does, moved forward. The story that began with a single act of dismissal had blossomed into a movement, had reshaped conversations in classrooms, offices, and homes, and had, without question, touched countless lives. Yet for Sundar Pichai, the work was not done, not merely because movements could fade without stewardship, but because he understood deeply that true change must be generational. It must be embedded not only in professional environments or educational frameworks, but in the hearts and habits of everyday life, passed on from parent to child, leader to employee, teacher to student. It must become culture. That thought weighed on his mind as he sat one late evening in his Mountain View office, well after most lights had dimmed. The only glow came from his screen, where he reviewed a new set of global reports on the Pichai Principles and the Global Dignity Accord. The data was promising. Empathy and leadership surveys had risen, reports of bias incidents in participating companies had decreased, and dignity education modules were now reaching over 5 million children worldwide. But statistics, he knew, told only part of the story. The true test was whether these shifts would endure once the initial wave of passion inevitably receded. Sundar leaned back in his chair, gazing out over the darkened campus. His thoughts drifted, as they often did in these reflective moments, to his father. He remembered a lesson that had echoed through his entire life, not spoken from a stage, but shared quietly in their humble Chennai home long before he ever knew of Silicon Valley. True change, his father had said, is not in grand gestures but in small everyday acts. If you treat the tea vendor and the company chairman with the same respect, you have already changed the world. It was that spirit Sundar resolved to preserve. And so, in the months that followed, he focused on one of the most challenging yet rewarding aspects of cultural transformation, institutionalizing dignity not through top-down mandates, but through grassroots ownership. He worked with leadership, teams at Google and other organizations to create dignity champions, volunteer networks of employees empowered to lead empathy training, mediate conflicts, and inspire their peers through storytelling and example. The model spread quickly. In campuses from Bangalore to Berlin, employees began forming dignity circles, safe spaces where they shared personal experiences of dignity granted or denied, and brainstormed ways to foster a more respectful culture. One particularly moving moment came when a janitorial staff member in Google's London office shared her experience in a dignity circle. "For years I felt invisible," she said. "But now people greet me by name. They ask how I'm doing. It may seem small, but to me it is everything." Stories like hers reaffirmed the movement's purpose, but Sundar also recognized that cultural change required ongoing renewal. He partnered with leading behavioral scientists to develop subtle nudges, visual cues, feedback loops, and leadership practices designed to embed dignity into daily organizational behavior. Micro-affirmations, simple practices like learning, names, active listening, and celebrating unseen contributions, became part of leadership training. Meanwhile, the Global Dignity Accord gained further traction. Inspired by its success, several cities around the world, starting with Helsinki, Singapore, and Cape Town, adopted dignity charters in public services, pledging to uphold respect in government interactions, healthcare, and community engagement. These municipal efforts, though experimental, sparked early successes. Reductions in citizen complaints, improved trust in public officials, and heartening stories of bureaucrats going the extra mile to treat every individual with care. Back in Chennai, the Respect First movement continued to thrive. The House of Elegance, once a symbol of exclusion, had become a living case study in cultural redemption. Sundar's parents, though private by nature, were occasionally invited to speak to young audiences about values. At one such event at a local university, Raghunatha Pichai shared a story from his early engineering days, how a small act of kindness from a British manager had shaped his own leadership philosophy. His closing words echoed through the auditorium. "Dignity costs nothing, but when given it enriches both the giver and the receiver beyond measure." Sundar, upon hearing of his father's talk, felt an immense quiet pride, yet he remained wary of complacency. Movements, he knew, could harden into slogans if not constantly renewed through reflection and action. With that in mind, he convened a new working group of youth leaders from around the world, students, young entrepreneurs, activists, and artists. He called this initiative Voices of Dignity and tasked them with shaping the next chapter of the movement, one that resonated with a digital native generation and adapted to emerging challenges in a hyper-connected world. The young leaders responded with extraordinary creativity. They designed interactive digital curricula, launched viral storytelling campaigns, and even created a mobile app where users could track and share moments of dignity they witnessed or enacted. One feature of the app, the Ripple Map, allowed users to visualize how one small act of respect could inspire others across geographies. Sundar was particularly moved when one day, the app highlighted a ripple that began in a Chennai metro station, where a young man had helped an elderly stranger and cascaded through hundreds of acts of kindness across Asia. These new tools gave Sundar hope that the movement would endure beyond his own leadership. But amidst all the progress, a new personal chapter unfolded, one that deepened his sense of purpose even further. In the summer of that year, Sundar's teenage daughter returned from a school trip deeply moved. She had witnessed casual discrimination at a hotel and had spoken up for the staff member who was mistreated. At dinner that evening, she recounted the story and said simply, "I remembered what you said about dignity, Papa. I couldn't stay silent." Sundar felt a surge of emotion. Of all the accolades and milestones, nothing meant more than knowing the values he had inherited from his father were now taking root in his own children. For that was the ultimate legacy. Not programs or charters, but living values passed from heart to heart. In the years that followed, the dignity movement continued to evolve, carried forward by countless voices and unseen acts. Its origins faded from public memory, as they should. For as Sundar often reminded new generations of leaders, the goal is not to remember how it began. The goal is to ensure it never ends. Yet in one small home in Chennai, now visited occasionally by young admirers seeking wisdom, an elderly man still rose each morning, donned his simple dhoti, and treated every soul he met, from vegetable vendors to rickshaw drivers to bank managers, with the same unwavering respect. And across the world, in ways both grand and quiet, the light of dignity continued to spread, sparked by a father's grace, a son's resolve, and a universal truth, as old as humanity itself, that every person matters, every story matters, and dignity once given can light the world.